All right, before we dive into the madness, I would say a word of caution. What you're about to hear isn't some abstract policy talk. It's about the quiet decision made by unelected elites that could end up dragging Europe into not one, but two major wars. One with Russia and the other one with China. I've recently discussed this with a former UK diplomat, Ian Proud. Links in the description. And yes, I know that sounds dramatic. But if you have been sleepwalking through Brussels' foreign policy, or trusting the headlines spoon-fed to you by the usual suspects, you're already behind. And no, it's not just interesting for Europeans, because what is happening is affecting you no matter where you live. So I made this video not because I love talking into a void or into an empty microphone. I made it because I just published this article on Substack. It's a 16,000 word investigation that took me quite some time composing. It traces the rise of Kaja Kallas, UrsulaVonDerLeyen, and the war logic infecting the EU today. The problem is, what I found absolutely floored me. But being realistic, I know most people aren't going to sit down and read a 16,000 word expose. In fact, we know from multiple studies that 60 to 80% of internet users get most or all of their news from just the headlines. And around 75% of social media users share news links without clicking or reading the full article. The same is true, of course, for traditional print media. Makes you wonder why we keep writing articles in the first place. So that's exactly why I'm recording this. Not as a substitute to the article, I still hope and recommend you to read it, but to underline the importance of what is going on behind the scenes, right under our noses, and to make it easier for you to access this kind of information. Once you have digested how we got here, the report gives you three scenarios. One, a limited proxy war, exactly what we are seeing right now, contained to Ukraine. Two, regional war between NATO and Russia. Regional meaning war in Europe. Three, systemic war means NATO versus Russia plus US versus China. I analyzed all three scenarios. I give you the strategic, economic, social and financial costs and the potential geopolitical outcome for each of them. So this doesn't just concern diplomats or generals. It concerns you, your job, your wallet, your family, and potentially your life. And no, I'm not being overly dramatic. It concerns the shape of Europe, the fragility of peace, and the terrifying possibility that Europe is being maneuvered with intent, quietly, undemocratically, into a two-front confrontation we cannot win. I argue that the war in Ukraine is just a warm-up. The real goal, the one people like KajaKallas are whispering about behind closed doors, is a simultaneous escalation with Russia and China. I know that's hard to digest, but here's the thing. They are not hiding it anymore. It's all out in the open, and I will show you where. Let's start with Kaja Kallas, Estonia's former prime minister. Now the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs. Not elected by the European public, not accountable to national vote, but wielding enormous power over the EU's foreign and defense posture. Now, don't get me wrong, her backstory is powerful. She comes from a family deported to Siberia by Stalin. Her mother was literally an infant on a cattle train. That trauma is real, and it shaped her politics. But here's the thing. Personal trauma is not a foreign policy doctrine, and certainly not in your name for all of Europe. And when you start seeing Putin in every Russian and Stalin behind every border, you don't get a strategy, you get escalation. Right now, in July 2025, this isn't just academic. In the past few weeks alone, we had China openly warning the EU not to let Russia lose in Ukraine. Kallas doubling down on the Russia now, China's later theory, arguing that if Europe doesn't stand firm in Ukraine, Beijing will be emboldened to move on Taiwan. So they have significantly upped the stakes. First they said, if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he will invade the rest of Europe. And now they are saying, if we don't stop him, China will invade Taiwan. You see the pattern? And NATO's new Secretary General, the former PM of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte, publicly said we need to be prepared for a two-theater war. Not hypothetical, not distant, now. He said, and I quote, Europe must hold the line in Ukraine and prepare for escalation in the Indo-Pacific. They are discussing how to transform Europe into a war economy with your money. That is no longer a thought experiment, it's doctrine. And you? Did you vote for any of this? Did you vote for programs like SAFE, for ADIP, or for Rearm Europe? Did you vote for the 900 billion that are being fast-tracked for arms funding and being justified through obscure emergency treaty clauses? This isn't war through consent. This is war by technocratic manipulations. Europe was supposed to be a peace project, remember? Born from the rubble of two world wars, committed to democracy, multilateralism, rule of law. But something changed. Especially since 2022, the language out of Brussels sounds less like peacekeeping and more like war planning. And it's not just about Ukraine either. Under Kallas and von der Leyen, I have to say, the EU has taken a hard turn. Military spending is up across the board. Arms production sold to you as economic stimulus is in reality the greatest wealth transfer in a generation. Your money goes to US arms manufacturer because this is where NATO countries buy its arms. Meanwhile, China policy is copied and pasted from Washington hardliners. Legal shortcuts are used to bypass public debate. And somehow, the same leaders telling us we must defend democracy aren't too keen on democratic oversight themselves. I have covered how far they go with shaping public opinion and stifling critical voices in my pieces about NATO's cognitive warfare program, where they virtually target your brain with sophisticated psychological techniques to manufacture consent for war, and the European Council Resolution CSFP 2025-966, which basically criminalizes dissent and allows them to not only freeze your assets, but also the assets of your family, if they ever please to do so. NATO's cognitive warfare program, implemented in 2022, is the worst because it virtually targets your brain. They target and want to shape what you think. If that's news to you, you might want to consider watching or reading what I already have published on the topic. But I warn you, it's going to be a wake-up call, and I'm saying this as an academically trained behavior analyst. Both initiatives go against the very fabric of what we spoiled Westerners think is our natural birthright. That we can say what we want and that we are not propagandized or brainwashed by our own governments. Only Russia and China do that, right? Wrong. You can find the links in the description. But coming back to Kallas & Co., I know what some of you are thinking. Okay, that's just how international power works. No one really votes for foreign policy anyway. Sure, but ask yourself, what are the stakes right now? Because they are not abstract anymore. You're already seeing it in your energy bills. You're seeing it in inflation, in migration, in defense budgets eating into social spending. And if this escalates, say if Russia retaliates with force, if China cuts critical exports or opens a second front, we're not just talking about proxy war anymore. We're talking about continental war, conscriptions, your sons and daughters being picked up to fight. Von der Leyen just laughed when she was asked if her children were in the army. Hard borders, shut down war economies, refugee waves that make 2015 look like a warm-up. So in this video I want to walk you through three things. How we got here, the rise of this unelected war logic. What in July 2025 makes this threat more immediate? and what Europe could still do to pull the emergency brake before it's too late. Because you have to realize, if we don't start demanding a voice in this process, if we don't start challenging the Kallas doctrine, then we deserve whatever comes next. But first, I want to talk about the real power dynamics inside the EU today and why it should terrify anyone who believes in democracy. Let's talk about power, specifically the kind that doesn't knock, doesn't ask, and doesn't wait for permission. The EU was built on compromise, on balancing national interests, on bureaucratic consensus. But since 2022, and especially in the past year, that architecture has been quietly overridden. Today we have a handful of unelected executives making continent-shaping military decisions with barely a whisper of parliamentary debate. And I'm not talking about minor treaties or humanitarian aid here. I'm talking about hundreds of billions in arms spending, about defense pacts, weapons factories, and permanent militarized foreign policy. And the architects? UrsulaVonDerLeyen, Kaja Kallas, and a handful of security hawks in Paris, Warsaw, and the Baltic states. Not presidents, not prime ministers, not people you voted for. Look, I know some people defend this. They say these are extraordinary times. Russia invaded Ukraine, China is getting aggressive, there's no time for bureaucratic red tape. Okay, sure, but emergency is now the default setting. Von der Leyen's commission tried to push through a 900 billion in arms investment using Article 122, a clause designed for natural disasters. You have to really let this sink in. That's not just bending the rules, that's executive warfare by legal fiction. The European Parliament's legal committee, and mind you, this isn't some fringe group, said absolutely not. This is an abuse of process. So they tried to block it. But here's the thing. Their intervention was purely non-binding. Yes, the Juri committee called it an abuse of process and protested the bypassing of the parliament, but that's where the power stopped. Their legal opinion has absolutely no force. That's a paper tiger. And so Kallas and von der Leyen can still run the package through without democratic consent. This is exactly how it works. Invent the emergency, override the rules, and bulldoze dissent. Manufacture the crisis, then use it to manufacture consent. You see the pattern here. And then, of course, there's the language, the slogans, the euphemisms, like this gem. The European Peace Facility. Sounds like a meditation retreat, right? Wrong. It's a 5 billion a year off-budget mechanism that buys bullets, missiles, tanks. Peace facility, my ass, pardon my French. This isn't Orwellian by accident. It's designed to numb you, to make rearmament feel virtuous, to smuggle war into your living room under the brand of security. And Kallas, she's not even pretending anymore. She's tweeting things like, the EU wants Ukraine to win this war. She's not tweeting, support Ukraine, not stand with democracy, but win the war. That's a war aim, full stop. Now, in a normal democracy, you would expect this to trigger a fierce public debate, right? Not in Brussels. Because in Brussels' worldview, the public is there to ratify, not to deliberate. Decisions are floated in white papers, baked in think tanks, dressed in legalese, and then passed through like a done deal. And this is exactly how Kallas operates. She drops memos to ministers on Sunday nights, demanding 1.5 million shells and GDP-based quotas for each state. France and Germany find out after the fact. Diplomats are blindsided. But the press narrative, Kallas leads Europe in a bold wartime push. No debate, no vote, just emotions. But here's where the things get fragile, because while Kallas and von der Leyen play queen on the chessboard, the public mood is noticeably shifting. And it's shifting fast. In Germany, the AfD is polling second, sometimes first, 27 to 30% depending on the day. In Italy, the Five-Star Movement is openly voting against weapons packages. Even Salvini's League is rebellion within Meloni's coalition, calling the rearmament plan as betrayal of Italian interests. And in France, Le Pen is sitting on a goldmine of discontent. She's framing Macron's Atlanticist line as suicidal. Meanwhile, across Europe, people are asking, where's the money for housing, for energy relief, for food? Why are we cutting social programs to fund a war we are not even fighting? So, as I'm recording this in July 2025, the numbers speak for themselves. 62% of Italians oppose cutting social budgets for defense. Support for arming Ukraine until victory dropped 15 to 20 points in Sweden, Denmark and the UK. Over 6 million Ukrainian refugees are now in Europe, and the EU's Court of Auditors just flagged that cohesion funds are lacking metrics to handle the schools, housing and medical pressure. And get this, even as Eurozone inflation dips, German households are staring at a 23% gas price hike in January thanks to infrastructure fees. So thank you USA for blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. Thank you USA, that's literally what the Polish foreign minister Radek Sikorski tweeted right after the Nord Stream pipeline attack in September 2022. So I'm not making this up. So you think that's sustainable? You think voters won't push back? I argue we are not far from a tipping point. Now, while all of this discontent simmers at home, Brussels is looking east, far east. And here's where the Kallas doctrine really gets dangerous. Because she is not just playing defense against Russia, she is trying to extend the same posture to China. Her argument? If you want to stop China, you have to defeat Russia. Simple, right? It's seductive, draws a straight line between Moscow and Beijing, frames everything as part of the same authoritarian axis. But geopolitics isn't algebra. By linking the two, she's doubling the threat surface. She's tying Europe's survival not just to Ukraine, but to Taiwan, the South China Sea, rare earth supply chains, semiconductor production in Hsinchu. That's not strategy. That's gambling with the second front. And let's be honest, Europe can't even handle one war on its doorstep without American help. So how exactly is it going to fund, supply and sustain a confrontation with China? The US is already pulling back. Trump's back in office. He's cut aid to Ukraine. He wants Europe to step up, which translated means you are on your own. That's exactly what triggered von der Leyen's Rearm Europe plan. To plug the gap with up to 900 billion in defense funding. But again, without public debate. It's like the commission saw Trump coming and said, oh no, the Americans are gone. Quick, give ourselves emergency powers. So let's be very clear. We are watching an elite class, unelected, unchecked, rushing to militarize Europe. They want to expand its geopolitical footprint and lock in decades-long confrontation with two nuclear-armed states without telling the public the real costs. They only say it's about standing with Ukraine, but it's about far more than that. For them, it's about institutional power, historical trauma, strategic delusion. And unless we stop to question it, unless someone breaks the script, this train doesn't slow down. Now, next up, let's talk about the most dangerous scenario, the one we are quietly sliding into right now. The stuff for nightmares, a two-front war with no off-ramps. So let me repeat what I just said. This isn't about Ukraine anymore. And it's not just about Russia either. It's about a doctrine, a worldview. One that says Europe must now prepare to fight Russia and China at the same time. And the scariest part, Nobody's even denying it. Let's talk about that line from Mark Rutte, for example. He said, and I quote, "We must prepare for the possibility that if China moves on Taiwan, Russia may simultaneously attack NATO." What a pipe dream. Now, pause for a second. Just sit with that, because that's not a statement, it's a setup. It sounds like strategic foresight, like, oh, he's just being cautious. But what he's really doing is laying the groundwork for something much bigger and much more dangerous. Let's be very clear. There's no credible intelligence, none whatsoever, that says China and Russia are planning some tag team assault on the West. That's not analysis. That's a narrative. It's a story. One that just so happened to justify a massive military buildup and the global expansion of NATO's reach. Convenient, don't you think? China's got its own game in Taiwan, that's correct. But Russia's stuck knee-deep in Ukraine. The idea that they would coordinate a two-front war against two other nuclear alliances, it's fantasy. But more importantly, it's useful fantasy, and that's exactly the point. This kind of talk isn't about preventing war, it's about selling one. Or at the very least, selling the preparation for it. The budget, the deployments, the emergency laws, the contracts, all of it. It's threat inflation, plain and simple. Inflate the danger, pump up the fear, and you can pretty much do whatever you want after that. Call it readiness, call it deterrence. Just don't call it peacekeeping. Now, let's not forget who we're talking about here. Rutte is not some neutral expert. He's a career politician, just stepped out of one job and into the NATO throne. And he didn't get there by accident. Washington and Brussels know exactly what they are getting. Someone who'll stay on the message, play ball, and push the agenda. And this dual front war stuff, it's a classic. You stitch together two different theaters, Taiwan and Europe, and boom, now you've got a single global threat that demands action. It blurs everything. Motivation, geography, timelines. Suddenly any escalation by any adversary becomes a reason to rally the troops. But the real kicker, it's self-fulfilling. You keep floating this idea that war is coming from all sides, and guess what? You start behaving like it is. You provoke, you posture, you escalate. And before you know it, you have made the thing you were supposedly trying to avoid inevitable. So yeah, this isn't strategic wisdom. It's strategic theater. Manufactured crisis to manufacture consent. And people need to call it out, because once this kind of language becomes the new normal, once it's in the bloodstream, it's really hard to walk back. So let it sink in. They are preparing for a simultaneous two-front war against two nuclear-armed states. And the question no one is asking is, can we even survive that? Now look, I'm not naive. I get why this narrative has traction. It's easy to sell. Frame it like this. Ukraine is the frontline against authoritarianism. Russia and China are the same threat wearing different masks. If we blink in Ukraine, Beijing attacks Taiwan. Simple, clean, emotional. But here's the thing, it's also catastrophically wrong. It's wrong because you don't counter a two-pronged nuclear-armed alliance with emotions. You need strategy, diplomacy, cold realism. And Europe has none of that right now. What we have instead is doctrine by trauma. We have taken Kaja Kallas' personal history, real, painful, valid, and projected it across an entire continent's foreign policy. She sees Stalin in Putin, so now they uses it too. But guess what? That doesn't make it good strategy. It makes it dangerous dogma. Case in point, China. Credible reports confirm that in early July 2025, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told Kaja Kallas that Beijing cannot allow Russia to lose Ukraine. You see how those two wars merge? That's not ideology, that's chess. They want the US bogged down in Europe so they can move in Asia. You don't need to be von Clausewitz to understand that. But instead of cooling things down, what does Brussels do? They slap sanctions on Chinese drone makers. They condemn China's rare earth export restrictions. Because, of course, only we, the West, can slam sanctions on anyone. And Brussels just nods along as Washington escalates. And behind closed doors, von der Leyen is quietly floating a China Strategy 2030. And it reads like a Cold War blueprint: containment, decoupling, deterrence. Do you feel the pressure building? Because I certainly do. And it's not just some abstract geopolitical anxiety. It's real, it's visceral. My argument is that Europe is being set up. This is how you have to see it. Not as peace broker, not as neutral stabilizer, but as forward operating platform in someone else's war game. We have become the terrain, the next battlefield, and we are arming for it like sleepwalkers with dynamite. Let me paint you a picture. Ukraine becomes an endless meat grinder, like it is already, draining resources and morale. Taiwan erupts and the US pivots to the Pacific, or the other way around, which, if you ask me, is more likely. Russia sees the moment and makes a move, on Kaliningrad for example, or maybe a Baltic state. Europe is alone, the US has retreated. Europe is outgunned and now facing war on two continents. And the problem with this? It's not even clear what victory looks like. Ask 10 people in Brussels and you get 10 different answers. What's victory for Ukraine? Total expulsion of Russia from every inch of territory? How realistic is that? Or victory in Taiwan? Maintaining the status quo? Somehow. Meanwhile, the military planners keep whispering that NATO is not ready. And China keeps stacking chips, literally, while Europe debates whether to double its defense budget or triple it. This is madness. So what's the way out? What could we do if we want to avoid this slow-motion suicide pact? I will get into that in the final segment, but before I do, let's be honest with ourselves. This isn't a movie. It's not a triumphant ending guaranteed by the arc of history. Peace doesn't come from vibes and good intentions. It comes from choosing not to follow bad ideas off a cliff. And right now, Europe is following some very bad ideas. Escalation as virtue, rearmament as identity, conflict as inevitability. And worst of all, silencing anyone who questions the script. I have some of the candidates on my channel. So if you're still watching or if you're still listening, first of all, congratulations because you're ahead of the pack. But don't let this become the new normal. Ask yourself, what's coming next? Because what could come next could make the war in Ukraine with over 1 million dead or wounded look like just a little skirmish. Alright, so I've unpacked the logic. We have seen the escalation. We have followed the bureaucrats straight into the abyss. Now let's talk about the exit. Because yes, it still exists, but not for long. And certainly not if you keep letting this play out like it's just business as usual, because it's not. It's not normal for European leaders to talk about nuclear powers like they're regional thugs. It's not normal for the European Commission to sign off a 900 billion in rearmament without a continent-wide vote. And it's definitely not normal to treat diplomacy like a sign of weakness. But that's exactly where we are. Like the US ambassador Charles Freeman told me in a recent interview, diplomacy is dead. And he was right. In July 2025, diplomacy has become a dirty word. And anyone who suggests peace without total military victory, they get smeared instantly as naive, cowardly, or compromised. Well, guess what? If believing in peace makes you naive, then the world is being run by lunatics. And here's the brutal truth nobody wants to say out loud. We cannot win both wars, not without losing something else entirely. We can't outgun both Russia and China. I mean, how crazy is that? We can't outlast them. Do you know how many people live in China? And even if we could, at what costs? How many decades of austerity? How many more waves of refugees? How many more surveillance powers will we, the people, have to hand over to protect our democracy? How much of that democracy will survive when the crisis becomes permanent? You think COVID eroded your civil liberties? Wait until war becomes the excuse for everything. Wait until every protest is a hybrid threat. Every dissenting voice flagged by some Brussels disinformation panel. Again, read or listen to what I published about the European Council Resolution CSFP 2025-966. We are not walking towards victory. We are walking into a system of burnout, and they know it. That's why they are rushing everything now, before the backlash crystallizes. But there's still one lever left. Not in the institutions, not in the council, in the public. That's you. And they know it. That's why they pump millions into NATO's cognitive warfare program. Again, links in the description. Because here's the thing they didn't count on. That people might start paying attention. That the fog might lift. That behind the slogans, the hashtags, the smirking, strategic communications, people would smell the smoke. And that they might ask, hold on, who decided this? When did escalation become destiny? Why is no one offering an off-ramp? Because look, we all know peace isn't about hugging dictators. It's not about ignoring atrocities. It's about knowing what happens if we don't stop this spiral. So ask yourself, why hasn't the EU appointed a real diplomatic envoy to Moscow? Why is China now more economically entangled with Russia than ever? Exactly the scenario Brzezinski has warned about in his grand chessboard back in 1997. Why are mainly US arms producers enjoying record profits, while food banks across Europe are overwhelmed? Why are people who got every forecast wrong in 2022 now the ones writing doctrines for 2030? You feel the heat rising? That's not panic, that's clarity. You're seeing the machine for what it is. And it's not pretty, it's not smart, it's not in particularly well hidden anymore. So here's what I want you to do. Not tomorrow, not after coffee, now. Ask the question your leaders refuse to answer. What's the exit plan? What does success even look like? Because if they can't answer that, they don't deserve your consent. And if they can answer it but won't tell you, they don't deserve your trust. Now, if this video stirred something in you, don't just nod along and scroll past. Talk about it, share it, argue with it. But for the love of reason, don't stay silent. Silence is the oxygen of this escalation. Destruction is its armor. And denial is how empires sleepwalk into disaster. You endured me this far, so you are smarter than that. Europe deserves better than that, and history will not forgive another generation that saw the storm coming and shrugged. Now, the full article this video is based on, it's not an easy read. It's long, it's dense, it's brutal. But it's the most important 16,000 words you might read in a while. And if this video woke you up, then go read it, because what's coming next, it's already being drafted. It's already being funded. It's already being built, unless we stop it. Now, I think I'll leave you with that. Remember, the next war doesn't need to be fought. But if it is, you will know who planned it. And you'll know who stayed quiet. Make sure you're not one of them.